Hello again. A summary of the written text on pages 47 to 49 in Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism, critiques the hermeneutical approach of full preterism, particularly in its interpretation of eschatological passages. Here are the main points raised. Full preterists deny a future world-changing second coming or Parousia of Christ, asserting that all biblical prophecies regarding it were fulfilled in AD 70. Steve also argues that full preterists apply a shoehorn hermeneutic, where the author argues that full preterists approach biblical text with a preset parameter, forcing every eschatological passage to fit into the AD 70 fulfillment. Now, this contrasts with partial preterists, who are seen as having the freedom to interpret each passage individually. Now, although he contends that full preterist leaders do meticulously consider texts, he claims that they cannot do so independently of their pre-established AD 70 framework. They are, quote, obligated to find a clever way of making it fit the AD 70 mold, end quote. He also contends that full preterists practice a forced exegesis. The analogy he uses is that of fitting various shaped blocks into holes that are all the same shape. This leads to, quote, unnatural and uncharacteristic interpretations, and in some cases, ridiculous exegesis when passages don't naturally align with the AD 70 fulfillment. Finally, the text quotes someone named J. Adams, who states that full preterists only interpret correctly when discussing passages agreed upon by all preterists, full and partial. When advancing their unorthodox views regarding the resurrection, the return of Christ, and judgment, full preterists make a, quote, hash of the scriptures by forcing interpretations. In essence, the critique is that full preterism sacrifices natural textual interpretation for the sake of maintaining a rigid, predetermined theological system concerning the timing of prophetic fulfillments. So, Steve, in his critique of full preterism, asserts that this theological view is characterized by a denial of a future world-changing parousia, and that it relies on a shoehorn hermeneutic to force text into an AD 70 mold. Now, here's my vigorous refutation of Gregg's position. It reveals that his analysis itself suffers from a selective and incomplete exegesis, ultimately appearing to prioritize preset traditional frameworks over a comprehensive and consistent reading of Scripture. First, Gregg's central claim that full preterists deny a future world-changing parousia fundamentally misrepresents the full preterist understanding. The contention is not a denial of Christ's parousia, but rather a firm assertion based on Christ's own words that the one prophesied parousia was inextricably linked to the first century. Jesus explicitly states in Matthew 24, 29 to 31 and 34, immediately after the tribulation of those days, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Further, in Matthew 16, 27 to 28, he promises, quote, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, these are not ambiguous statements. They establish a clear first century time frame for the singular parousia. Gregg's framework struggles to integrate these explicit temporal markers, suggesting that it is his own paradigm rather than the full preterist one that necessitates a reinterpretation or downplaying of such direct declarations. Second, the accusation of employing a shoehorn hermeneutic is more aptly directed at Gregg's own methodology. He claims full preterists cannot consider, quote, every relevant text independently of their gratuitously preset parameters, end quote, yet it is Gregg's adherence to a future parousia that forces him to engage in what is aptly termed confusing eisegesis when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of first century fulfillment. Now, the New Testament, empowered by Jesus' 40 days of instructing the soon-to-be inspired writers of the gospel and the epistles between his resurrection and ascension, that's Acts 1:3, presents a unified narrative of redemption. The individual texts are indeed building blocks that are beautifully woven together. They are woven into a narrative whose climax concerning the end of the Old Covenant age and the establishment of the new was anticipated and realized within the generation that Jesus spoke of. So here's a newsflash. In all of Scripture, there's not one single reference to an end of the world or end of the universe. It is always the end of the age, the Old Covenant age. And try as you might, you will not find any specific prophecy for a yet future parousia of Christ, a resurrection, or another judgment. For those like Steve to vigorously insist such a reality are merely presuming and presupposing based on creeds and confessions and church tradition. For all who view this video, I implore you to view in their entirety all of videos on my channel currently and those to come. I am pointing out to you how futurists, including partial preterists like Steve Gregg, jump to conclusions with sophistry, suppositions, and proof texting, while full preterists argue with the words of Jesus and the inspired writers. Now, third, Steve Gregg's criticism of J. Stuart Russell's interpretation of the word nations in the Great Commission as tribes in Palestine reveals a significant blind spot in his own exegesis. Gregg dismisses this interpretation as a forced effort to, quote, save his view, end quote. However, the Greek word for nations is Strong's G 1484 ethnos, which includes meaning a tribe, nation, people group. More importantly, Gregg completely overlooks the explicit testimony of both Jesus and the Apostle Paul regarding the first century completion of the Great Commission. Consider the following, Matthew 24:14. Jesus declares, quote, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in, all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Here world, G3625 oikomene, specifically denotes the inhabited earth, frequently referring to the Roman Empire. This was a clear expectation of fulfillment prior to the end of the Old Covenant age. Romans 10:18, Paul emphatically states, their sound has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Again, world, G3625 oikomene is used, confirming that Paul believed the gospel had reached the then known inhabited world. Colossians 1:6, Paul affirms, quote, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing among you since the day you heard it and truly understood God's grace. Colossians 1:23, Paul reiterates, this is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, have become a servant. These passages aren't obscure. They are direct declarations from the inspired authors that the Great Commission pertaining to the preaching of the gospel to the oikomene and every creature under heaven had indeed been accomplished in their time. Gregg's failure to incorporate these crucial scriptural affirmations into his analysis demonstrates a profound oversight. He accuses full preterists of finding, quote, a clever way of making it fit the 80-70 mold, yet it is Gregg who struggles to reconcile these explicit scriptural statements of first century fulfillment with his futurist expectations. In conclusion, Steve Gregg's assertions against full preterism are vigorously refuted by a more thorough and consistent examination of the scriptures. His critique appears to stem from his own, quote, preset parameters, end quote, leading to an incomplete and selective exegesis. By overlooking the explicit temporal statements of Jesus regarding his parousia, and by disregarding the apostolic testimony of the Great Commission's first century fulfillment, Gregg ironically exemplifies the very, quote, bending and twisting of passages he attributes to full preterist. It is his devotion to creeds and confessions and church tradition that ultimately appears to color his futurist conclusions rather than a comprehensive analysis of all relevant biblical texts. Now, I'm going to close here for now. Please comment. God bless.